Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar. My name is Aditi Ramola, and I work as a technical project manager at the International Solid Waste Association, which is based in Vienna. And we are hosting the webinar on behalf of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Municipal Solid Waste Initiative, just also known as the Waste Initiative. And I welcome you to this webinar where we're going to introduce policy instruments for financial instruments for municipal solid waste management. The webinar is going to be led by Nadia Scharen. She's a principal energy and infrastructure finance associated at Abt Associates, and also James Alexander from who's the city finance program director at C40 Cities. So the webinar is going to introduce participants to the financial readiness toolkit that's been developed by Abt Associates. And it's also going to give you an overview of the different financing mechanisms available to cities to deliver municipal solid waste infrastructure, including funding and financing options that cities can consider, and also case studies of public-private partnerships for municipal solid waste. Please kindly mute your microphones during the presentations. After the presentations, there will be time for about 15 to 20 minute question and answer session, and you can ask your questions aloud or type your questions into the dialog box on the left hand corner of your screen. So without further ado, I give the floor to Nadia and James. Nadia, if you'd like to start with your presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Aditi. If anybody else on the line,
Jenny, would you please mute yourself?
Thank you. Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and ISWA for inviting me to present at this webinar. So, like Aditi was mentioning, my name is Nadia Scharen. I work for a company called Abt Associates. Abt Associates is a research and consultancy firm specialized, among others, in energy, environment, health, and education. And we are a contractor for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And since 2013, Abt has been assisting the EPA in its role as a lead partner in the Clean and Climate Air Coalition Waste Initiative. So more specifically, Abt has been assisting EPA and other waste initiative partners in addressing challenges related to securing financing for projects in the waste sector. So my presentation today will focus on financing solid waste management projects for municipalities, and it's split into three sections like presented here in this outline. So first of all, it'll be about the general overview of the solid waste management sector. Then it'll be about financing solid waste management, which will cover PPP, key considerations and structuring, as well as financing alternatives. And finally, I'll talk about the initiative that we developed on behalf of EPA for municipalities to assess all the steps needed to access financing for municipalities, from enabling environment, municipality willingness, and project risk assessment and mitigations. So first of all, the solid waste management overview. Here, this is a first initial graph, but solid waste management is one thing just about every city government provides for its residents. While service levels, environmental impacts, and costs vary dramatically, solid waste management is by far the most important municipal service and serves as a prerequisite for other municipal action. Currently, as we can see here on this slide, global municipal solid waste generation levels are approximately 1.3 billion tons per year, and they're expected to increase to about 2.2 billion tons per year by 2025. So this represents a significant increase in per capita waste generation rates from 1.2 to 1.42 kilograms per person per day over the next 15 years. And as there's a lot of urbanization, it's very important to start as soon as possible to start managing municipal solid waste. On the next slide, this represents, according to Waste Atlas Partnership, the 50 largest dump sites in the world. And the term open dump is interesting because it's used to describe disposal sites without liners and gas management systems, and without anti-flooding measures and sound operations as well. And I think what's very important to take away here is that municipal solid waste generation rates, which is the concern here of this growing solid waste, it's impacted by the economic development, the degree of industrialization, the public habits, and local climate. On this next slide, this is very important, and it's the consequences. What are the challenges that we're facing around the world when we're not dealing with solid waste management? So residents, especially in developing countries, and I would say even more the urban poor, are more severely impacted by unsustainably managed waste. And waste is often disposed in developing countries in unregulated dumps or openly burned. And these practices, as you may know, have impacts. Firstly, they're serious on the health, the safety, and have environmental consequences, because poorly managed waste serves as a breeding ground for disease vectors, contributes to a global climate change through methane generation, and even promotes urban violence in some cases. But secondly, what's important is that even though municipalities may be willing to address this issue, they come with a financial challenge on their side, because effective waste management is very expensive, and it often comprises, on average, about 20 to 50% of municipal budgets. And by 2025, it is estimated that solid waste management costs will increase to $375 billion. So operating this essential municipal service requires integrated systems that are efficient, sustainable, and socially supported, and this needs to be addressed. Here, this is a slide that I included, and it's a slide of the Clean and Climate Air Coalition. What's very important is it really summarizes the challenges, the solutions, and the benefits when addressing solid waste management. And what we can see is that the challenges are from a environmental health and safety side. It's really the emissions of methane and black carbon, and at the different steps where this has an impact. And the solutions are mentioned, which are really, and we will go further into this further, but it's really to reduce methane and black carbon emissions, which are both the third and the second, respectively, pollutants and contributors to climate warming. We need to have efficient waste collection, transport, and handling, preventing waste burning, divert the organic waste management by composting and anaerobic digestion, and also in the final stage, I would say, is to use landfills and produce gas for waste to energy as the final disposal options. So there are different steps that I'll be mentioning here in this second section, where I'm going to go more further into financing solid waste management projects. So what's interesting here in this slide is really the value chain. So solid waste management projects address the entire life cycle. The solution to manage waste is to treat it as a resource. So solid waste management systems include the following 5 critical milestones that I'm presenting here on the slide: the collection, haulage, recovery, and disposal of waste, as well as the energy generation, as I was mentioning. And all of these activities can be bid out, so structured and either bid as contracts or as concessions, and can separately or together to private entities. In most countries in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance, waste management practices have led to more efficient uses of resources and lower environmental impacts. As an example, on average, the EU member countries recover 60% of municipal solid waste and transport it in raw materials and energy. So here I'm going to detail over the next slides a little bit about ways to reduce and improve solid waste management. The first one is by building efficiency in solid waste management. So it's really here about finding ways to improve solid waste service delivery and fee collection. And there are very interesting, successful examples in Nepal and the West Bank that the World Bank structured on this. Secondly, it's also building efficiency in solid waste management by promoting source separation and recycling. And this is a lot about the government working with the private sector, the residences, and the commercial to provide this collection and really be able to efficiently manage solid waste management. And there's also interesting cases in China, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And finally, one important part about building efficiency in solid waste management is by strengthening waste collection and transport in underserved communities. So, and it's really applicable to low and middle income cities, and it's to improve the services in these communities, and all of this renders to actually after when providing this efficiency, it reduces the amount of solid waste that is produced. And in this slide here, this is one of the most important ones. What we see is that state and municipalities have the opportunity to convert open dumps into efficient and cost-effective solid waste management system implementation by providing technical and financial criteria in the concession agreements with the private entities. But what needs to be addressed for this is that is these criteria here. This is a little bit the main criteria for consideration to ensure that the municipalities have the financial readiness to before it starts issuing a concession, for instance, for a waste management project. So it needs to ensure that the municipality needs to ensure that it has the proper infrastructure in place. So do they have the facilities? What is going to be the strategy of the infrastructure, the location, the transportation? The second part, and this is the most crucial part, is the enabling environment. Are there the legal structures and institutions in place to support and provide a comfort to the private entities that the contractual agreements that will be in place under the solid waste management systems will be respected? So what are the national and local policies, the regulations on proper disposal, on enforcement? Is there sufficient knowledge, capacity building, and training of the staff at the municipality level, but also the ones that are managing the solid waste management in order to efficiently address this issue? Also, there's the need for public awareness, and the participation and behavior change is very important of the people that are in each of these municipalities. Finally, it's important to formalize the jobs, especially when we're talking here this third part about the social inclusion. So for the waste pickers, so this is very important for safety, for social safety nets, for child labor restrictions, and also for education. And this fourth part is the financial sustainability, and I'll go to this a little bit further down the road, but it's about the taxes and fee structures, because when there's always the issue that when there's improvement in the system, there will also be a higher cost for the end users that will be contributing from the system. So this needs to be put in place, and also there needs to be a dialogue with the communities on this. And finally, it needs to also be ensured about the health and the safety in order to disseminate this information in the public, that how these projects will really improve the health, the safety, and the environment of that location. So here in this slide, I think this is the most important one where we talk about public-private partnerships. It's in order to structure these types of projects, it's important to involve not only the public and the private entities, but also the civil society. And these public-private partnerships can enable to formalize a risk sharing between the public and the private entities, and results in measurable improvements in efficiency and quality of service. So at the end of the day, the PPP objectives are about risk sharing, mitigation between the public-private sector, transparency of the proposal, and the main objective is really to have a project that is financially, economically, politically sustainable in the future. And that's why in this graph, all of these four players are essential. From the private investor that's going to provide the equity, the management experience, and technical experience, to, on the right, the civil society to be engaged, to know that these projects are important, to even be a local workforce for the municipalities or the private sector in these projects, and really be engaged in improving this project for the municipality. And thirdly, the government, it's essential from the financial support, but also from the political support for the legal and regulatory framework, like I was mentioning before. And finally, the private investor will seek financing from the lenders. So there needs to be in place, like I was mentioning, the risk sharing, ensuring that all of the risks are properly addressed. And so then the lenders will provide local currency facilities in some case when needed, and credit guarantees, collateral guarantees, and other types of structures, which I'll be mentioning in the further slides. So this is exactly what I was mentioning is the different structures that can, financing tools that can be used to structure solid waste management projects, and they're really fourfold. So the first one is, it could be a public financing, and there's four ways of financing local public goods, which is through the local taxes, the user charges, thirdly, the grants that could be done at the central state governments, and fourthly, raising funds through capital markets. So it would be the government that would be issuing bonds to finance this project. The second way of financing projects is through traditional loans. It can be bilateral and multilateral development banks, which often provide concessional financing for these types of projects. There's also ECAs, so export credit agencies, for import of equipment from specific countries that will provide specific financing from specific ECAs related to those countries. And finally, the international and local government and commercial banks. There's this third alternative, which is the one that is being very much discussed and has rendered very good success cases, is result-based financing. So result-based financing for municipal solid waste is a financial mechanism through which the payment for solid waste services is conditioned to the achievement and verification of pre-agreed targets. And what result-based financing does is that it offers really an opportunity to innovate in the use of development finance in the solid waste sector and also achieve results. So we can go further after in detail in that if needed. And finally, it's development policy financing, so technical assistance and loans through PPP mechanisms. So oftentimes, especially multilaterals or donors or impact investors seek to both provide technical assistance for capacity building, knowledge sharing, technology issues, and also provide a loan in parallel for the financing so that the project will be properly managed in the future. In this final section here, I'm going to talk about our initiative with the Municipal Solid Waste on financial readiness. So the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Municipal Solid Waste Initiative seeks to provide assistance on technical assistance, on capacity building, on networking and information sharing, and on assistance in identifying and securing financing for projects. And there is all of those different areas that are mentioned here on the right, from oil and gas, waste, bricks, cook stoves, agriculture, finance, etc. And here we're going to focus, we're focusing specifically just on waste. And in this initiative that we developed, this readiness toolkit that it was developed late last year, and it's for access to finance. So Abt Associates developed a readiness assessment tool for municipalities that was conducted on behalf of the US EPA and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Municipal Solid Waste Initiative. And this tool assesses both the level of policy and regulatory support for the project, as well as the readiness of the project's risk assessment and risk mitigations, technical and financial plan. And what's important is that by addressing these answers, the tool seeks to ensure that municipalities are ready to tender an offer that will sufficiently attract investors to bid successfully for the projects and enable to access finance for the project. So it's all this evaluation of financial readiness and potential. And this slide and the following are a snapshot of some of the stages and outputs sought to develop a PPP municipal solid waste project. So here we can see there's the city assessment. What is the data used? The city assessment form. Secondly, it's about the technical work plan and the studies and validation of the technical usage and the capacity building training. The third part is the one that we developed, is the evaluation of financial readiness and potential risks, the financial work plan, and the studies and trainings that are required. And fourth, finally, is the readiness to launch. It's preparing proposals, reviewing, and finalizing the contracts. And within what I was mentioning here on the evaluation of financial readiness and potential risks, this is a snapshot of what we would ask, like examples of evaluation questions, and then provide this as an evaluation to ensure that the municipality is ready. So it's from the political environment, from the regulatory environment, the legal framework, what are the revenue streams in order to repay the loan, the financial and technical expertise, and the final stage would be the bidding. And here, these are really the objectives of the Financial Readiness Evaluation Toolkit. So it raises awareness of challenges and potential pitfalls. It helps cities to identify gaps or areas of potential risks. And finally, the third objective of the Financial Readiness Evaluation Toolkit is a goal to help cities advance to the stage 4 that I was mentioning, which is really the bidding, which is focused on actually securing the financing. So you only go to the bid once the financing is secured. Finally, lastly, I'm just going to mention a quick example, which is of public knowledge on the PPP Knowledge Lab website. And it's, in a nutshell, it's a successful case study of a PPP solid waste management project. and it's the Poznan incineration and energy generation plant in Poland that was developed under a PPP project in 2013. And as a result of an agreement that was made between the city of Poznan and Suez, the total cost of the investment was a little bit less than $200 million, and the project was financed by private financing associated to EU cohesion funds. So it's sort of a hybrid financing. And what's very important, there are a lot of social benefits and economical that are linked to this project, because the incineration plant is going to reduce the amount of landfill communal waste originating from the capital of Poland and from nearby municipalities, and consequently it will serve more than 750,000 inhabitants. Also, annually, this plant will generate electricity, and heat will be derived from 210,000 tons of waste. And this heat energy generated in the waste incineration process will, through the cogeneration plant that was built in parallel, will provide to the citizens of Poznan this energy. And then finally, what's important is that the revenues that are generated from the energy produced for the citizens of Poznan, and also from the excess energy that will be sold to the national electric power system, these revenues will be transferred to the city budget, and therefore it's a win-win situation for both the public and the private sector in order to ensure that the project will be will really be successful, is to really engage the public and the private sector. What I would say in a nutshell is that when governments decide to invest in new projects and new technologies for solid waste management, they must design its strategy, not only structuring and issuing the bid, but also investing in projects that have a long-term operation. And it's very important to train local teams with providing expertise in operating and maintaining the project, as well as monitoring and evaluating the positive social, economic, and environmental impacts of the project. So thank you very much, and I'm open for any questions that are being needed. But before that, I'd just like to introduce my colleague, James Alexander from C40. So that he can present also his section. That's a continuation of mine. Thank you. So, James?
Hello, I'm just uploading the presentation, so hopefully that will display in a second. But anyway, thank you very much, Nadia. That was really fantastic, and hopefully what I'm about to present does follow on very closely from what you were just presenting, maybe goes into a bit more detail in some things and leaves you to have done the detail on others. So so with any luck, this will be a very nice follow on, and actually hopefully provide a lot of good value and guidance and information. So thank you so much to Aditi and to CCAC for the invitation to speak on this webinar today, talking about municipal solid waste infrastructure finance. So just a quick introduction to what we're going to cover. So first of all, why cities, why municipalities? What's the role of municipalities in this space? What challenges do cities have when it comes to financing? What considerations do cities need to make when funding and financing projects? And finally, I've got some city examples that might be useful to give a kind of real life perspective on what's actually happening in cities on the ground. So first of all, a bit about C40. C40 is a network of the biggest cities in the world. We have 91 members, which might not sound like very much, but that's actually 15% of the world's population. And quite staggeringly, a quarter of the world's GDP happens in those cities. But we're not just focused on big cities. We want to capture all the learning from the big cities and share that knowledge as far and as wide as we can. And we're always happy to work with cities that want to know and understand things that are happening, lessons that have been learned, mistakes that have been made, so that those mistakes are not replicated. And we are, of course, a long-term partner of CCAC, and we've been co-chairing the Municipal Solid Waste Initiative for a number of years, and we're really proud and grateful for the support from CCAC over many, many years. Over the last couple of years since the Paris Agreement, where cities became a really important part of the world's climate negotiations, we've done some research with a partner called Abt, and we call that research Deadline 2020. And what that did is show the real reason fundamentally why we need to support action to reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from cities. And that is because if we can't reduce the emissions from the big cities or from all municipalities, we're never going to achieve as a globe the commitments that we've all signed up to under the Paris Agreement. And if we look at the business as usual scenario for greenhouse gas emissions, which of course includes short-lived climate pollutants, particularly from waste in municipalities, if we look at business as usual scenarios, we're going to completely blow the budgets of carbon that were set in Paris and that would hold the world under 1.5 degrees of warming. And in fact, the really alarming statistics are that if you look at just the C40 cities, those 91 big cities in the world, which are spread all over the world, not just in one part of the world, those 91 cities will blow their own share of the 2100 carbon budget by 2025, and even more scarily, they will actually use up the entire world's carbon budget, which needs to last until the very end of this century. They will use that up on a business as usual scenario. They'll use that up by 2060. So we must take action dramatically to change the trajectory that cities are on in terms of their emissions, and we must do it very, very quickly. So in the context of cities being huge emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, what we also know is that cities have got huge powers to take action, and mayors are very important players in the global climate discussion and climate debate. And while we see agreements made internationally by national governments, the implementation of those agreements is always going to happen locally, which what that really means is that the battle against climate change will be won or lost in our cities. And one of the key elements of that battle and winning that challenge is overcoming the finance barriers. And cities report to us at C40 that finance is one of the biggest, if not the biggest barrier that prevents climate action from happening in cities, because the mayors have got a very strong vision and really committed to take action, but the finance needs to flow in order to make that possible. And so some of the challenges that cities face, and this is a similar list to what we just heard, but this comes maybe from a different route, so it's very interesting to see that the challenges are listed as the same. It's a lack of capacity. So cities want to turn their really good ideas, their strong vision, into projects that people can invest in. But that's a very tricky thing to do. It's a very difficult route. And so we find cities really struggling to take an idea, to take a transformative concept and turn that into an investment-ready project. And the costs of doing that, preparing a project for investment, can be very significant. And cities need to find ways to fund that upfront. At the same time, we see a lack of awareness of what investors are actually looking for. And on the other side of that, a lack of understanding from investors on what it is that cities are doing, where the opportunities are, where there are chances to invest in specific projects, and new things that investors can do. Cities often have competing priorities. There's never enough money to go around. I'm sure we've all experienced that challenge. And so how to make to achieve as many things as cities need to achieve in terms of emissions, whilst meeting all the needs and priorities of the city. Sometimes cities have got limited powers and responsibilities in terms of fundraising or financing. Cities also have poor creditworthiness, and so financial management is extremely important for cities in order to make sure that they keep and maintain strong credit ratings, which is the key aspect of allowing cities to borrow at an affordable rate. At the same time, there's a lack of certainty on the revenues coming in. And cities need to really get a lot better and need a lot more support in collecting the taxes, the user fees, the tariffs that they're due. And then finally, there's a lot of politics. Now, the key thing to note on this list is that lack of money in the world is not a challenge. There is lots and lots of money available in the world for well-prepared projects. In fact, we know of infrastructure funds that are desperate to find projects to invest in, but they're struggling to see the projects that are there in a way that being ready in a way that they would invest in them. And actually, that's even more important when it comes to green projects, because increasingly we're seeing investors willing and able and under a lot of pressure to put their money behind green projects, but there's a lack of projects out there that they can actually invest in. So the door's open on the other side. If cities can create and structure the projects, particularly the green projects, the projects that will reduce short-lived climate pollutants, such as waste projects, then there are investors there willing and ready and waiting to take those projects forward. And so from a city perspective, there's a need and a requirement to focus on both the sides of the project financing and funding discussion. On the one side, there's a need to look at financing, which is fundamentally, where will the money come from to build the project? How do you bring the money in to actually structure the project? Now, often that comes from loans or from grants. And then, of course, there's the other side of it. You can't just think about where does the money come from to build it. You've got to think about, well, what will happen once it's finished? Where will the money come from to repay those loans, or to bring back in the money to repay for the project? And so that's the funding. So how will that financing be repaid once the project's in operation? The cities, of course, need to look at both sides of this. Otherwise, they're getting themselves into debt that is not sustainable, and no city wants to be in the position where they've got debts that they can't afford to repay, because that has much bigger long-term ramifications and prevents future projects from being possible. So just focusing, I'm going to focus on both sides for a few minutes. And so on the financing side, there are a few core sources that cities can look at. Again, this is a slight recap from what we heard in the previous presentation. So on the one side, there's the city's own source revenues, money that the city has. There's other sources of revenue. So whereas the city got other mechanisms or means to bring in revenue, there's of course debt. There's equity, which is giving shares of the project to other partners, or of course there's a combination of all of these in various different proportions. And what different things to choose will be often up to the city's own circumstances. But the important thing is that cities need to take a very strong look at all the different options that are available. Compare that with what they're actually able to do, both in terms of things they're able to do from a legislative or legal perspective, what are they empowered to do by the national laws of the country, but also what is out there in terms of, and what makes sense in terms of the financial position of the city, and of course what's politically acceptable for the city to consider as well. So in terms of financing, there are some 4 core questions. What are the basic options for urban infrastructure finance? Then thinking about what financing can be provided through the private sector, then what can be provided through international organizations, and finally, what can be provided through the public sector. So going through those very quickly, some of the basic options include obviously taking out loans, which is just borrowing money, which of course then has to be repaid, but is often one of the ways that cities are structuring and financing their projects. Another option is subsidies or intergovernmental transfers. That's money that comes from other areas of government that supports the city to take a particular action. And then, of course, there's revenues of the city that exist already, local taxes, or other sources that are not necessarily taxation. For example, fees for dumping rubbish, or fines or charges as well. Some of the private sector options, which can be built on top of this, which are in some ways similar to the kind of general options, include issuing bonds, a number of cities have got the power to issue bonds and have been doing so over the last number of years. We've seen cities issue green bonds. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But certainly there's different types of bonds that the city can issue, and green bonds have taken a lot of good publicity recently and seem to be having a lot of momentum. It may be one option that makes a lot of sense for a city to consider. In terms of public-private partnerships, we heard a bit about that previously, and there are a number of different ways that cities can do this, including lease arrangements, concessional financing, and joint ventures. There are other things. Full privatization is one option that some cities have considered. Infrastructure funds or crowdfunding from citizens or other people in the city can be another way forward. In terms of funding from or financing from international organizations, there are quite a lot of funds out there, an increasing number, particularly including the Green Climate Fund, which provides, which a lot of governments from around the world have paid money into, and is an option that cities can take projects to. It's not as big as people think that it is, so it's something to consider. But it's certainly not the only option, and there's lots of people at the moment thinking about the Green Climate Fund that might want to think about some other options as well. There's risk mitigation options in terms of reducing the risk to the city, but I think something that's listed on here in terms of carbon finance is where a number of cities have been burnt recently because the price of carbon has reduced significantly while cities have been structuring their projects, and so the project has then proved not viable. Again, I've got an example on this later on. Going further round, there's finance facilities that are beginning to be in existence, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the C40 Cities Finance Facility in a few minutes. But there's often grants for technical assistance and viability funding that can help close the gap between what funding is available and what funding the project needs to continue. Now, finally, the public sector. There's often municipal development funds, and an increasing number happening in countries across the world. These are government-owned institutions that can provide financing in different ways that can support projects. So this is part of the overall picture of how urban infrastructure can be financed. It's a complex picture, and within each of these there are a number of different options underneath these, and cities are advised to look at many of these. You know, a number can just be ruled out immediately because they're not within the laws or the structuring of that city is operating under, but on top of that, there are things that will make sense for some cities that will make no sense at all in other cities and other circumstances. And so getting very strong and very effective advice and impartial advice on which funds and which sources of financing to consider is a really important aspect for cities of preparing a project and figuring out the business model that makes the most sense and that is in the best interest of the city at that particular moment in time. So moving on from there, we look at the other side, which is, well, once you've got the financing, it's important to consider how that project will be repaid, or how that financing will be repaid once the project's in operation. So thinking about the funding. And there's three main sources of funding, revenue raising, that are open to cities. The first is tariffs, which is user charges, and a mechanism often employed in the waste sector. Another is taxation, sometimes general taxation. Property tax is the most commonly used taxation method in cities, but if you're going to rely on taxation to fund a project, it's very important that the taxes are collected, because if they're not collected, then the money doesn't flow and the project is in danger of not raising the money that it needs. And then finally, there's transfers, which is often non-repayable funds that come from other layers of government. Other governments in different countries often provide transfers of development finance, and so this is money that can add in and help make the project more viable. So here's a diagram for some of the funding options for urban infrastructure that exist. You'll see different elements of these are either taxes, tariffs, or transfers. So there's user fees in there, there's revolving funds, there's land value capture, and particularly air rights are part of that. And then charges for developers, and in terms of if a developer wants to take forward a project in a particular area, can you charge them to because of the increase in the waste that may come out of that. So various different things to consider, and underlying each of those there are some different options and considerations. Again, all of this needs to be really thought through before cities are preparing for are even thinking about the financing a project, because if this is not thought through, then the financial viability of the project, once it's been developed, may not be there, and that's a very serious position for a city to find themselves in. So having gone through that, I want to talk through a few examples of what cities have been doing around the world. And I mentioned that there'd be some examples on green bonds. So Johannesburg was actually the first C40 member in the entire world to issue a green bond. That included quite a lot of different projects. And the good news about that green bond, and Mexico City was the same, it was heavily oversubscribed. And what that means is that there are many more investors looking to invest in that project than there were on that bond, than there were spaces actually available in the bond. That is a very, very good thing for the project and for the city. And it seems as though being a green bond was part of what made that happen. Green bonds are attractive to investors at the moment. Unfortunately, they're not so attractive that they're seeing considerable reductions in interest rates, but certainly from a city perspective, they're giving really great publicity and very strong signal to the market about the city's green credentials and green vision. But more than that, they're allowing the city to pick up new investors. It means that bond issuances are going through and lots of investors are interested. And over time, we expect to see green bonds reducing costs by comparison to ordinary bonds. In Tokyo, in Washington, DC, they've created what are called credit trading schemes. Tokyo has actually installed a cap and trade scheme, which has been particularly focused on the energy efficiency space for large commercial buildings, and has been extremely effective in reducing, so far reducing the emissions of big buildings in Tokyo. There hasn't been a lot of trading happening in that scheme, but that's actually okay. What that shows is that the scheme started off at the right level, and building owners were encouraged to strongly reduce the emissions coming from their buildings or the energy consumption of their buildings, and that has allowed the project to the trading scheme to continue. I think over time we'll see trading between buildings, and that certainly is a market-based mechanism for encouraging reductions in emissions. Lagos is an unfortunate example, and Lagos were developing a waste project which would have used carbon credits. It was all set up. They spent a lot of time and effort figuring out how the carbon market and the official carbon credit system could subsidize or provide the bit of financing in the middle that made the project viable from being previously too expensive. Now, unfortunately, whilst the city officials were preparing the project and structuring it and getting everything ready, the price of carbon in the world market collapsed. And so what that meant is that selling carbon credits on the global markets no longer brought in the sort of money that the city had been expecting and required in order to make their project viable. And so as a result, the project no longer was financially viable in a carbon credit model. So the city had to go completely back to the drawing board. So it's certainly worth thinking about if you're looking at carbon credits as an option. It's worth very seriously considering how the low price of carbon right now is going to impact that, and whether it's worth going down that route when there are other options available. Cape Town has been a really strong example of how development agencies can provide financing, and what's called concessional financing, which is lower than market rate financing. And AFD, which is the French development agency, has provided several loans to the city of Cape Town to support the development of the climate action plan in Cape Town. And waste to energy has been something that AFD has been quite interested in. They've been looking at it from a perspective of this is technology that in some respects is untested, it's slightly risky. The normal credit markets might consider it too much of a risk to go into, but as a development agency with a development focus, they consider that this is something that's worth looking at and pursuing. And so they've worked with Cape Town to move that forward. And actually on South Africa generally, in the post-apartheid era, the cities in South Africa have had great success in increasing their own source revenues. Over the decades of apartheid, many people refused to pay their taxes because they didn't want to show that level of support to the political system and in power at that time. And as a result, when that ended, people were used to not paying their taxes, and it was very tricky for the South African cities to raise the financing or the money that they needed to make things move forward without having taxes being paid. But those cities went through some very, very effective public awareness raising campaigns, which basically pursued the message of, if you want public services, strong public services, which will make everybody's lives better in the city, then the only way to get that is by paying your taxes and by making sure that you make your share of your contribution to your local area and to your local community that can improve everybody's lives. And that's had some really fantastic success, but it was a lot of effort and a lot of time was spent doing it, but it was really very important. And now the cities are seeing the rewards of that because they have the money and the money coming in that allows them to structure the services, the municipal services that are having the effect in the communities that they should have. So coming through to the final few examples here. So London, Amsterdam and Toronto, particularly London because it's very, very much focused on waste infrastructure, have set up green funds. Sometimes they've been through the sale of a city asset, which has brought money into the city. And the city has said, rather than just spending this money in a normal way, the money might be lost, we're going to actually turn it into a fund that has a specific purpose and can use that money to bring in more. So the London Green Fund has been supported by some money from the EU. In Amsterdam, it was supported by the sale of the city owned a share of a utility company and they sold that and the money's gone into the fund. In Toronto, there was a large area of land that the city owned in the 1990s and they sold that and put the money into a green fund. That money is then lent out and very rarely as 100% of the project, but actually usually lent out as a share of the project, bringing in other money from the private sector. And that money gets then repaid into the fund, from where it can then be lent out to other projects and make more projects viable and possible. So it's a really strong and effective mechanism of using funds that might otherwise just have been lost in the general pot and allowing that to have a really strong positive impact in the city. Cities in Colombia are very lucky to benefit from a national development bank called FinDeter. And what FinDeter does is provide lending directly to municipalities, and that is globally a best practice example of how local development banks can be structured, local development funds can be structured that can benefit local areas. And so the states and the cities in Colombia benefit from concessional or reduced cost capital and financing through FinDeter, and that has been really effective in allowing those cities to develop the infrastructure projects that they need. In Sao Paulo, there's a really exciting land value capture program working. A number of cities have tried land value capture with various ranges of success, and what land value capture is all about is using the increases in the value of land as a result of a municipality building something or taking action to try and help finance some of that action. It's happening around the world, and Sao Paulo has done some interesting work there. In Boston, the Renew Boston Trust is all about trying to understand why the credit rating of the city in terms of its debt should be purely based on the number in terms of the actual size of the debt of the city. And what they're trying to consider in Boston is, well, can the credit rating be a bit smarter than that and think about what the debt has actually been used for? So if the money's been borrowed and it's just purely got to be repaid by the city, that's one thing. If the money's borrowed and then being used to reduce costs because energy bills go down, or being used to have other social benefits that have a positive impact on the city, should that have the same effect on the city's credit rating as other debt? And that's part of the fundamentals of the Renew Boston Trust. And then finally, Copenhagen has done some really effective work demonstrating the reason for investing in projects is because the societal benefits and the social benefits of the projects are so strong. And the real work they've done is on cycling. So cycling in itself doesn't bring back any money into the city, because people don't pay to cycle their bike along a cycle track. However, what the city has worked out is that because of the improvements in health, the improvements in air quality, the improvements in people's fitness and motivation, for every kilometre that people cycle in the city, there's a net positive gain to the city. And that's been a really important calculation in terms of justifying the expenditure on more cycling infrastructure. And I'm sure the same assessment of costs and benefits can be applied to lots of different projects. And generally, projects that reduce emissions in cities, particularly projects that improve health, that improve air quality, as many waste projects do, will have a very strong return socially to the city and should be very seriously considered when it comes to trying to make the case for why a project should be taken forward. Final few slides. This is a kind of diagram of where potential support can come from. And at the top left, there's the knowledge and capacity development. And there's lots of non-governmental organizations, including C40. There's the World Resources Institute that provide a lot of knowledge and can be a really good source of support for cities that are interested in learning more about some of the mechanisms that they can use. As well as that, there's development partners. I already mentioned AFD. There's the German Development Cooperation Agency, GIZ, who do a lot of work around the world on capacity development, which is all about building up the skills and knowledge inside cities that can be absolutely vital for helping cities to understand where they should be or could, what mechanisms they could be using. Of course, universities around the world are developing new expertise and knowledge. And within this context, there's the CCAC Municipal Solid Waste Initiative, which is doing a huge amount of work in terms of sharing knowledge and building capacity. On the top right, there's project development. And so thinking about where can support come from that can help cities develop the projects and actually get the projects up to a stage where people will be willing to make an investment. And so there's an increasing number of project preparation facilities, including, of course, the C40 Cities Finance Facility, which is the organization I'm part of. There's the Cities Development Initiative for Asia, which is based or works closely with the Asian Development Bank. But then, of course, banks, development banks, private banks, and infrastructure companies all provide project development support. I've written here to use caution in these because they're not necessarily working outside or in an impartial way. They're, of course, very interested in preparing projects such that you might take a loan from them or purchase their infrastructure, which might be fine, but it's important that you make that assessment of whether that is in the best interest of the city, and that you do take some impartial advice to see whether that really is the best solution. And it may well be, but it might not be. So it's always worth taking that caution there. And then finally, there's mechanisms that can allow for financing and for credit enhancement, which is about supporting reductions in the cost of capital. Of course, you've got private sector there, you've got the development banks, which are the MDBs. And then, of course, there are agencies and organizations that support credit enhancement and take on some of the risk of the project themselves so that you can reduce the cost of capital. And MEGA is the arm of the World Bank that does that. The USAID does some work in that area, and other bilateral donors. So the final slide from me, just a quick introduction to the C40 Cities Finance Facility, which is one of the project preparation facilities that exists. And our objective is to support cities around the world to prepare their infrastructure projects right up to the point where they receive financing. So it's very outcome focused, and we want our projects to get to financing. That's the end goal. We work between C40 and GIZ to deliver this project, and we're very grateful to support from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the UK government, and the United States Agency for International Development, who have all provided financial contributions to this project. It's an impartial program, which is very important because it's not doing anything except working in the best interests of the cities that we support and trying to determine the best financing mechanisms for those cities, as well as building capacity so that in future we won't be necessary. We hope that in future cities will be able to do this work on their own. And part of doing that is to capture all all the learning that we take from the projects we work on around the world and to share that far and wide with other cities. At present, we're focusing on transport, adaptation and energy, but we would love to move into the waste sector with this program, and we're looking for actively at the moment for support to do that. And then the main reason why I mention this is because we published a guide for cities on finance, which is available on our website, which is listed on the screen. If you can't find it, please feel free to drop me an email and I can send it to you. And that's got a lot of guidance and ideas and concepts that cities can work from in terms of where they might find financing for infrastructure projects. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for the time today and look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Nadia and James, both of you, for leading today's webinar and for the excellent insights into financing waste projects. You've both done a fantastic job in laying out what cities must take into consideration when looking into financing their waste projects. Thank you very much. And the floor is now open for questions. And because your presentations have been so interesting, we already have a lot of questions from the participants in the dialogue box. Would you want me to read them out for you? And
or Aditi, maybe each of the participants that are on the conversation could just explain a little bit more briefly their questions in chronological order. So maybe you can ask.
That would be an excellent idea as well. So we would start with Nust, if he can unmute himself and just ask the question aloud. I don't know if he's heard me, but what I can do is I can just read it out and one of you can take the question. So his question is, are there possibilities to finance data collection tools about the whole integral waste management for a local government, or do there exist developed data collection tools that you can share?
So I can take that one. So it's Nadia. I think one important tool that has actually been developed within the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, I think it was in 2013, and we can share the link because it's public information that anybody can have. It's a data collection tool for urban solid waste management, and the objective of the tool is to collect exactly municipal solid waste data in a consistent manner to serve the purposes of facilitating the development of municipal solid waste master plans for cities, to facilitate the preparation and implementation of investment projects, like, for example, for result-based financing that I was mentioning earlier, and also to explore potential opportunities for reducing the short-lived climate pollutants, the SLCP's emissions from municipal solid waste sector. And so it's a user-friendly tool, and it really provides the different steps from the waste collection, the recycling, the transfer station, landfill dumps, neighborhood collections for sharing, composting, and at the end the waste to energy, and also the overall assessment for result-based financing if that is the case. And it's a very user-friendly, easy tool, and this could be an initial tool, I would say, not necessarily the only tool, but a general snapshot that could be used. Then, of course, it's very important to mention that every municipality is different, and like we were stating before, the structuring of the financing, which is the ultimate goal, to transfer these costs to the private sector and not burden the municipality financing. That is very has to be customized. So there's the specifics of each of the different municipalities that have to be taken into account in the second phase.
Thank you very much, Nadia. The next question we have is from Kirsten, and she says, how do we assist municipalities to modify their cost structure where they can receive revenue from disposal of waste and find it a challenge to enter PPP, as that moves waste feedstock out of their systems? Either of you can take that question.
So So maybe I'll just start it, James, if you want to add anything on that one. I was mentioning in my presentation, so the cost for municipalities of treating waste is between 20 and 50% of its overall cost. It's a very high cost. In a lot of cases, in developing countries, half of the waste is not even treated, is not even put in a dump site. So it's very challenging to define the cost that is the overall actual cost for municipalities if they were to treat waste. But it is necessary and it can be done. What needs to be defined is first identify from the dump site, from all of the waste that is not being treated, censoring the population and defining what is, from a technical aspect, the technology that will be used, what is also within the value chain of supply waste management, if it's upstream, midstream, and downstream, like I was mentioning in one of my slides, what is the municipality wanting to establish? Is it fully from the waste, the treatment, the collection, so forth, until the waste to energy, or is it just part of the collection? Which is the parts that will be treated? And this will enable to define what is the cost structure. And within the cost structure, it's the three ones that can be relied on from the government's perspective, which are the tariffs, the taxes, and the transfers. And this enables at least a snapshot of what is the current situation, so the base situation, and then how it can be improved through the technology, through what is the willingness of the municipality to engage in improving its waste collection and reducing the methane and black carbon gases and so forth. So this is a little bit what I would say.
And then just for me to add on to that, I think, you know, when it comes to being able to issue to use PPPs, I think some, you know, there are some parts of the world that do not have a well-developed, structured PPP process, and that's generally a governmental decision or legislative maneuver that means that determines the PPP landscape. And I think what's really important is if you are either a city or working with a city that sees that PPPs could be a really valuable way forward to help finance some of these very, very difficult to finance projects, it's quite possible that you're going to need to do some engagement with the national government. But the good news is that often when it comes to things like this, if you can make a strong case, which generally is possible, particularly with the support of organizations like C40 that can show international examples, with other organizations, CCAC and others that have got some strong experience of where this can add value, governments are often quite open to recognizing what their legislation is constraining and then seeing how they can change it and make it better so that more things can be unlocked. That's definitely a way forward. And then I think the question, I can't actually see the chat box, so the question said something about increasing fees or receiving the fees. And I mean, I think that is partly good news, because cities have the power to do that, and generally it's already a rule that's in place. It's, you know, the decision to take fees or to raise taxes is already made. The next step is to actually go into the, you know, really actually do it, take it seriously, and make sure people pay it. Because the only thing one of the key things that stops people paying their taxes is if they find out that their neighbor isn't paying their taxes. Why should they bother when their neighbor isn't? So you've got to really increase that and take a concerted approach and effort to ensure people actually are paying things. Now, of course, when it comes to waste, that's extremely tricky. You don't want people to be incentivized to just dump waste anywhere. So it does require some enforcement, and you know, not many countries are getting this 100% right. but it doesn't necessarily require to be getting done 100% right. It just needs some money to be coming in, which is enough to make the project viable.
I think also a last point on this is that beforehand, there's one point that's very important. It relies on the municipality. So the municipality's willingness to move this project forward. And because of the changes of government at the municipality level that are also, and there could possibly be implications at the state and government level through the different transfers of possible funds related to solid waste management projects, it's very important, I think, that that the donors, the investors, and so forth, engage sort of immediately when there is a new change of government at the municipality level and put it as a priority, because these projects do take time to structure, from the technical aspect, the legal aspect, the financial aspect, and also the co-benefits that are rendered from the project, engaging also civil society in this. So it's important, I think, that all of the parties that are interested in this project really start voicing this to identified municipalities so that it's developed quickly. And I think that also there's another point that's important is when we talk, it's not necessarily just to think municipalities on an individual basis, but more grouping also municipalities, because some are very small municipalities. They don't have the capacity, the knowledge, the ability to figure out how to go forward with this. But if you group municipalities together, you have a bigger mass of population, so a bigger mass of waste. And this is something that attracts private investors because it's a larger size project. And then it's a negotiation between these municipalities that can be facilitated by donors and investors to see who is the municipality that would have this landfill, for instance, and what type of fee could be shared between the municipalities that would pay to have their waste collected and transferred to these other municipalities. So I think it's important to discuss, when discussing a PPP per se, to really think about all of these different scenarios, and therefore to discuss as quickly as possible with municipalities at an earlier stage in order to have a project that's meaningful and that will attract investors into the project at a very early stage within the government agenda. Let's put it that way. I hope we answered your question, Kirsten.
Thank you both. Thank you very much. The next two questions come from Marco. His first one being, is there any rapid costing tool to estimate the overall cost of a new municipal solid waste system, something specifically dedicated to municipal solid waste, like the ones developed by WHO for healthcare waste?
So I can start. I think it's like I was mentioning, and I think this is a question also that relates to the first question by Ramus on gathering information. So really to identify the tools, the cost for a new municipal solid waste management system. There's the one that I was mentioning from the CCAC that we can share after this presentation, and it's public information, and that would be, I think, the way to provide this rapid costing tool, and it's a more general one. But then what is needed is it could actually give a snapshot of, okay, how much would this cost? Then it has to be put afterwards in context to the local flavor. So the local cost of labor, the import or not, or of the equipment that would be needed, and what is what within the value chain of solid waste would the municipality be wanting to prioritize from the collection to up to the other side of the range would be the waste to energy. So I think all of this has to be discussed, but really that tool is one of them, at least the one I know that provides a snapshot. There are other tools as well the CIF that has been developed. It's a more general one, more complex one, but more detailed one, I would say, that looks all the different multilaterals. And it's been in place, I believe, for 2 years. This is also one we can share. It was done by initiative of the UN to really put multilaterals together to bring a cohesive tendance to how to develop projects, and so from energy infrastructure projects in general. And finally, I would say that the relevant element to your question is what is the depth and amplitude of the employed tool in order to comprehensively manage the applicable costs, because this is important. I mean, there's ideas of snapshot, but really within the snapshot and the willingness of the municipality, there are ways to, once those two are in place, I think it's very important to attract investors in some cases, capacity building for them, and knowledge sharing for the municipalities, and to also provide the support and the assistance from all of the different donors and investors communities, and that can be done rather quickly once those two parts are in place, which is really this snapshot that has, okay, what is the cost today? How can it be done in the future? And second, what is the structure that is going to be used? Like I was mentioning, is it just for this municipality? Is that municipality enough in terms of revenues to attract investors to this? Or should it be shared with other municipalities, which could take a longer process? And finally, just especially the willingness of the municipalities to engage in developing this project as a priority, given especially that this is a huge cost burden for them, like I was mentioning, 20 to 50% of the overall municipal budget, and how that can be transferred to the private sector.
Great, thanks, Nadia. James, do you want to add something to this? Or should I read out the second question?
Yeah, go straight to the second question, I think.
So the second question is, could you suggest any source of fundings for assessment / simple data collection / any other solid waste management related interventions? As often it is quite expensive to collect and analyze data that is needed for developing sound proposals, and to convince investors, donors, stakeholders, including public authorities, to change business as usual scenarios. So who wants to go for this?
So we're hoping that over the next few months we're going to be able to we're doing some work with CCAC, and we're going to be able to do some of this sort of work, providing that kind of first stage technical support for municipalities to collect the sort of data that they need to help them structure a project and develop a business model that will help them move forward with the project. I think there are also project preparation functions. There are development agencies out there that are doing this sort of work, but sometimes what's the it's not necessarily easy to, it's much easier to say this than to do it, but sometimes it's much easier to get the financing for the overall project if the city has put a little bit up front to demonstrate that it's committed to the project. And so if there is any spare budget that's able to be kind of scraped together to do some of this data collection, to understand some of this, then that can really help. Demonstrate the commitment of the city, and then that brings on board other people who say, okay, the city's already put in some resources here. We can that shows the commitment. We can now help by moving this forward.
Great, Nadia, do you want to add something?
No, nothing for that question. That's fine. I think it's what we were discussing prior as well.
Great. So then I come to the last question that's been asked by Priscilla, and she says, could you suggest any methodology, whether simple or any document, to quantify and monetize the benefits to diverse organic waste, such as reduction of fuel consumption, reduction of methane emissions, reduction of black carbon emissions, among others, such as the Copenhagen example for recycling, to demonstrate that the project has benefits to avoid externalities?
Yes, I think this is an excellent question. Thank you, Priscilla, for asking it. And really these co-benefits of the projects are really what should drive investments in these projects, because of what I was mentioning about the black carbon and the methane and its implications on climate change. I think that from my experience, every donor has its own way of evaluating these co-benefits, and every project is very specific. There are general tools that are used as methodologies for deriving benefits. So, for example, for the municipal solid waste recycling, they're calculated using the WARM, the WARM. But there are other methodologies. Under the WARM, it contains, I would say, some fewer material categories than other ones that are like, for example, the characterization report. These are some of the examples. I think it really depends on the priorities of the municipality and what is the municipality seeking to do, like I was mentioning, within the value chain of the privatization of the solid waste management. But they, for example, so the EPA uses those tools that I was mentioning to really determine the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy benefits for U.S. Recycling rates. But there are many tools. I wish there were one that we could, and I think it would be great to have one that could really just be a general tool. But I think that it's very, even though you have a general one, and there are different ways to find it depending on who is supporting the project within the donor community and the investors. I would say that it's important also to look at the local aspects and also what the municipality is trying to achieve, and in terms of improving its waste management system.
And just from my side, just to say, C40, we're really aware of the power of understanding the co-benefits, as Nadia rightly called them, and so we're doing a little bit of work right now to try and understand more how cities can do this. Very happy to share the Copenhagen example, though of course it relates to cycling. But generally these things are, looking at economic models. Some of them, it doesn't need to actually be that complex. But I agree that a standard model for looking at this and considering these co-benefits would be really helpful and would make a huge impact in helping make the case for why it's so important to have really strong waste projects and waste facilities in cities. I think there's some really strong arguments there that we need to think through. So yeah, if we can start getting some support for getting these sort of tools up and running and available to cities, that I think would make a huge benefit.
And I think this is often a case of that limitation in the sense for municipalities to make the project successful is the sense of, there's too much information that's required, or it's too complex, we're on our day-to-day and so forth. And I think it's very important for municipalities to know that there's a whole array of donors and investors that are interested in that have strong interest in prioritizing these types of projects of solid waste management. And we've seen that, like James was mentioning before, with green bonds, it's oversubscribed and so forth. So I think what's important is really to, as much as possible in each of the countries, to notify municipalities from early on that there is so much support that can be done, and all of the donor community is there to support, because this is really addressing solid waste management. You're addressing everything basically. It's the basis of so much, and it frees up money for the municipalities. It improves the environmental, the health, socially, and so it has a lot of benefits, and I think that there is a lot of tools out there. It has to be sort of, although there can be general tools like I was mentioning and other ones that could be developed, it's also very important to look at the local content, and really in the country itself, what are the access to finance, what are the structuring, what are the overall enabling environment to make these projects happen.
Thank you very much, Nadia and James. So the last question before we wrap up the webinar is from Priscilla again. It says, could you provide a list of international funding, particularly for solid waste management, perhaps like a list of banks?
So I mean, my way of thinking about this is that what is a bank looking for ultimately? A bank is looking for a project that they can get behind, that they know that the money is going to come back, is going to be repaid, and that the and that they're going to make a little bit of money on it. That's basically how a bank works. So if the bank, if you can go to a bank and demonstrate a financially viable project, then they'll finance it. So it's not I guess it's not really about giving a list of banks that can do projects, although of course the development banks are where you should probably be thinking, but it's more, how can you get your project structured into such a way that it will be something exciting and interesting that a bank will want to take forward. And I think that's the way you need to be thinking about it, is if it's a viable project and you can demonstrate that it's viable, then people are going to want to finance it. If you are struggling to demonstrate that it's a viable project, or if you have not yet got it to the stage where it really is a project, where it's more of an idea or a concept than a project, then you need to do the more work to get that, to get that project up, to get it up to that stage. And that is where there is money available from the development community to help make that happen, where project preparation facilities exist. But unfortunately, what we can't expect, much as I would love this to happen, but we can't expect the banks to get closer to the projects than they are right now. Much as I think we would love that all to happen. The banks are doing what they do. That's how they operate. We've got to figure out how to get the projects closer to what the banks want to see, rather than the other way around.
And I think that, just to add on to that also, I think it's an excellent question, Priscilla, because there's always concern, I think, from the experience that I have working with the municipalities, especially in these projects, of, oh, is this going to attract investors? But actually it does. When the project is properly structured through identifying the risks and mitigating them, and knowing that the legal and regulatory environment is in place, the projects actually start getting traction. The investors come, and they come already with their financing in place. So meaning that when there is a bid, there's generally the obligation to, what in one of the documents, of the bidding documents, is to provide the financing. So it could be just a bridge loan, a bridge to local or international development, or concessional finance, or result-based finance, and so forth. So it's already in place. It just needs, the project needs to be properly structured, the enabling environment, the willingness of the municipalities to move this forward, and make sure that both the municipality and the private sector and the civil society are all engaged in this project and willing to make it happen. So this is why this result-based financing works well for this case. But in terms of the international list, a specific list, I mean, I would say that is general list of the multilaterals, of the GCF, of the bilaterals. The local development banks have a very important role in this as well. And capital markets can play a good role, excellent role, the domestics or international, depending on the size of the project, and also what is the nature of the project in terms of the revenue stream, ensuring that there is a captured revenue stream that's going to be guaranteed to the private investor that's going to take over the project once the bid is in place. And in terms of banks, there are commercial banks, there can be public banks, government banks, local government banks in these projects. I mean, once the project is structured properly, the banks will come in. They will, because they'll have surety, or some surety of the revenues. They'll be understanding the risks and its mitigants. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both of you. And also thank you to the participants. It's been an exciting webinar. We've gone over the time that we had budgeted, but it's, there were lots of questions and lots of answers, so it's great. We will make the presentations as well as the link to the recording available on the CCAC knowledge page shortly. And hopefully you'll join us for the next webinars that we're going to organize. And till then, thank you once again and have a nice day.